Good afternoon. Welcome to this event, part of the Center for Mexican Studies series, The Mexican Revolution at 100, which commemorates this year, 2010, the centennial of the revolution. One of the most important socio-political events of the 20th century, the revolution changed Mexican society, setting the country's political, socioeconomic, and cultural path for decades to come. At the same time, the revolution deeply affected US-Mexico relations and drew the attention of artists, writers, and social thinkers worldwide, as post-revolutionary reconstruction provided a natural social laboratory for new ideas and institutions. Despite recent reforms, the long-term legacy of the revolution is visible in Mexico in multiple arenas, including politics, social movements, and education. A century later, the consequences of the Mexican Revolution are still with us. I would like to thank the sponsors of the series, the International Institute, the Latin American Institute, and the Center for Mexican Studies, of which I'm the director. Yours truly, Rubén Hernández León, also faculty in the Department of Sociology. And I would like to thank especially my colleague, Professor Jorge Bravo, in the Department of Political Science, who actually facilitated the contact with Mr. Cárdenas. At this point, I would like to ask you to silence your cell phones and other electronic devices so we can actually proceed with our lecture. Today's speaker does not need an introduction, as he is indeed one of the most important political figures in Mexico. Mr. Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas Solórzano is the founder of the Partido de la Revolución Democrática, or PRD. He's a former senator and governor of the state of Michoacán and first democratically elected head of government of Mexico City. A three-time presidential candidate, Mr. Cárdenas Solórzano is a leading figure in Mexico's struggle for democratic transformation. The title of his presentation today is The Legacy and Promise of the Mexican Revolution, and I give you Mr. Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas.
Thank you, Rubén. It's an honor to be here with you. I'm very pleased to be here in UCLA once more. As Rubén said, Mexico is commemorating this year the bicentennial of the independence and the centennial of the Mexican Revolution. It is for us Mexicans a time of remembrance, how these 2 centuries, and particularly this past century, have gone off, what has happened to build what we have of positive, and what has happened to have the present we have. 100 years ago, revolution broke in Mexico. Since then, the Mexican people have been struggling to make effective the exercise of their political rights and to make effective the full exercise of the nation's sovereignty. The social and political movement known as the Mexican Revolution exploded as a reaction against a long-lasting dictatorship, an authoritarian regime centered in one man and in one man's decisions. It was a social reaction against the change-resistant system. Nothing seemed to move in Mexico. Apparently, everything remained immobile. People were tired, disenchanted, irritated, for there were no opportunities for those offered by the dictator. Porfirio Díaz decided life in Mexico. Porfirio Díaz, a hero in the war against the French intervention and Maximilian of Habsburg's empire, ran twice as presidential candidate and lost. He took arms protesting the outcomes of those elections, was militarily defeated, arrested, and amnestied. He persisted in rebellion, ousted the president, and was proclaimed president. His uprising had been under the slogan of no re-election, no more re-election of the President of the Republic, where lie and emerge all evils of the nation. He served his term from 1876 to 1880. A close politician to him, a general who has himself has fought against intervention and the empire, was elected or chosen by him to succeed him. When time arrived, arguments were found. He was the necessary one, the indispensable, and Diaz was elected for his second term, 1884-1888. The Constitution was reformed in 1887. The president could opt for re-election once, only once, and Diaz became candidate and was elected for the next term, 1892. Another constitutional amendment took place, and from then on, there was no limit for repeated re-elections. Diaz was candidate in 1896, in 1900, 1904, this time to serve a 6-year term. Then he made a big mistake. Diaz gave an interview to an American journalist, James Creelman, the interview which was published at the same time in Mexico and in the United States in March 1908, in which Diaz declared Mexico was mature for democracy, democratic practices should revive, he would not be candidate in 1910, and he would see favorably the emergence of an opposition party. Nobody believed he could not run, but many thought there would be a democratic race for the vice presidency. By 1910, Diaz would be 80. The term would end in 1916. So in public mind, there was that whoever were to be Diaz vice president would succeed him within the term. The Creelman interview also provoked the emergence of an anti-re-election movement. Francisco y Madero, member of a well-to-do family with a relevant position in local politics and business in the state of Coahuila, actively participated in the promotion of an anti-re-election movement. He wrote a book, The Presidential Succession in 1910, in which he severely criticized the Diaz administration and proposed the creation of an anti-re-election party, which he began promoting. He became the presidential candidate of that party. When time arrived, Diaz announced what everybody was expecting, that he would be candidate once more. A few weeks before election day, Madero was charged of committing a crime and arrested, as were other 5,000 of his followers all around the country. He was given the city of San Luis Potosí as his prison. While prisoner, the election took place in July 1910. The election, as every election during the Porfiriato, was a rigged one. Diaz was declared president-elect, and the country, with Diaz in his head, prepared to celebrate in nearby September the centennial of Mexico's independence. Large and impressive diplomatic missions arrived in Mexico from all over the world to be present in those celebrations, parades, diplomatic receptions, dedications of museums, new schools, the opening of the National University, and so on. Diaz was at the climax with full control, with the country in his fist. At least, this is what seemed to be. In parallel to all those events, from some years back, something had been boiling under the surface. Discontent was much deeper and much more extended than what people in government thought. By the turn of the century, a small group of self-called liberals had been organizing around the country, distributing their publication, Regeneration, demanding the government to stop violating the Constitution, to strictly comply with the reform laws, the separation of state and church, suppression of religious education in private elementary schools, ban of religious practices outside the churches, ban of public officials' presence in religious ceremonies, calling to restore democracy through peaceful and democratic means, and convoking to organize the Mexican Liberal Party. The head of and the most important leader of this movement was Ricardo Flores Magón. The Diaz administration was intolerant with political criticism and opposition. So when the liberals opposed Diaz's re-election in 1903, calling it for a democratic transition through elections, they began to be persecuted, many of them jailed or forced to exile, their publications forbidden, finding no space in public, open politics. This situation led them to a radical turn in their position. for they began preparing an armed uprising against the government. By mid-1906, the liberals made public a manifesto and their program, the program of the Mexican Liberal Party, which contained their most important demands and proposals. The first one, to reform the Constitution and suppress the possibility of re-election of the President, the Vice President, and the state governors, which was the political core of the Diaz regime. The program also demanded a completely lay education to establish that foreigners, when acquiring real estate in Mexico, lost their nationality, becoming by this sole fact Mexican citizens. A maximum of 8 hours working journey, a minimum daily wage of 1 peso, obligation of employers to pay for labor accidents and to provide hygienic housing for their workers, the annulment of peasants' debts with the hacendados, to grant land to any solicitor with the sole condition of making it productive, to establish a maximum surface of land the state could grant to a solicitor, to protect the Indian race, to establish bonds of union with Latin American nations. Vagonistas also convoked the people to take arms to overthrow the Porfirian government. During his imprisonment, Madero had not been idle. He had kept contact with his followers, making preparations to rebel, and as part of these preparations, drawing a plan. Part of the plan was his escape from his prison city to Texas, and from San Antonio, he launched the Plan of San Luis Potosí on October 5, 1910, in which he rejected the outcome of the election, demanded its annulment, called to restore democracy, return the lands of villages and small landholders, mostly Indian, dispossessed by the dictatorship, proclaimed himself provisional president, and convoked the people to take arms against the government, starting precisely on November 20 at 6 p.m. Social unrest, as a consequence mainly of a long drought and very poor crops for several previous years, the aspirations of change provoked by the Diaz-Quilman interview, the penetrating ideas of the Mexican Liberal Party's program, the anti-re-election movement, which had been expanding and rigged the election, created a favorable climate for the Plan of San Luis, which found fertile soil to ignite the revolution in November 1910. Madero's convocation shook the country. Revolution erupted everywhere. New military leaders became to be known: Pascual Orozco, Francisco Villa, Emiliano Zapata. The Federal Army was incapable of controlling the uprising and suffered a serious defeat, more political than military, when Ciudad Juárez, the most important border city, fell in the hands of the revolutionary commanded by Orozco. Diaz resigned the presidency and went to exile. The peace agreements of Ciudad Juárez were subscribed between the revolutionary and the government. A new presidential election was to be held, but Madero made 3 big political errors by accepting these agreements as were proposed to him. He accepted a provisional government to succeed Diaz, not headed by a revolutionary, but by a recognized Porfirian. The licensing of the revolutionary armies, leaving the federal army intact, and the acceptance as legal of the Congress selected by Diaz, elected in 1910, with which the new government would have to deal. The new election took place. Madero was elected in the fairest election ever held in Mexico. But the revolutionaries were anxious to have their demands met and began revolting even before Madero was elected. Pascual Orozco withdrew recognition of Madero as chief of the revolution. Emiliano Zapata proclaimed the Plan of Ayala, claiming the immediate restoration of lands to dispossessed villages. Orozco was defeated and went to exile, and Zapata was held with more or less difficulty under military control. Porfirians revolted too. Bernardo Reyes and Felix Diaz, Porfirio's nephew, in different moments called to overthrow Madero. They were both defeated and imprisoned. At the same time, Madero had to face opposition in Congress, fierce criticism from the Porfirian press, now free and unrepressed, and the urge of the revolutionary, who found a very slow and obstructed government incapable of giving response to their demands. On the other hand, the germ of revolt was alive within the federal army, that is, among the Porfirian generals who had been kept in command. After 15 months of a troubled new administration, the coup arrived. The main instigator and conductor was U.S. Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson, an admirer of Diaz who viscerally disliked Madero. He compromised with the military commanders of the capital and the coup succeeded. Madero and Vice President Pino Suarez were arrested, forced to formally resign, and held prisoners in the National Palace. A provisional president succeeded them for 45 minutes, in which time he named the military commander of the city Secretary of Government, resigned, and was succeeded by the newly appointed. Victoriano Huerta, the usurper, as he's known in Mexican history, who ordered the assassination of both the president and the vice president. The revolutionary immediately reacted. The governor of Coahuila, Venustiano Carranza, assuming as first chief of the Constitutionalist Army and in charge of the executive power, declared the federal pact broken, the state of Coahuila recovering its sovereignty, proclaimed the Plan of Guadalupe, calling the people to take arms, denying recognition to the usurper government, and claiming to restore constitutional order. After several months of hard fighting, the Constitutionalists, as Carranza's followers were known, triumphed. But revolutionary victory was unstable. Revolutionary factions, Constitutionalists, Villistas, Zapatistas, tried to reach an agreement but failed. Fighting was resumed, revolutionary against revolutionary. Constitutionalists on one side, Villa and Zapata on the other. Constitutionalists defeated Villa, who withdrew to Chihuahua. Zapata kept control of large portions of the state of Morelos, where land was restored to the villages. Constitutionalists, save for Villa and Zapata strongholds, held control of the country and established provisional military state governments, beginning to implement new policies, like the distribution and land distribution and the recognition of workers' rights, and Carranza convoked a constituent Congress. The Congress met on December 1916 in the city of Querétaro. Carranza submitted a project considered mild, conservative, by a radical wing of constitutionalism. In the background of revolutionary ideology, in every faction, the ideas of the Liberal Party's program are found. We also find Zapata's agrarian demands, which since 1915 had been adopted and shared by constitutionalism. Intense discussions took place in Querétaro. The radicals imposed most of their points of view. It's in the Constitution where the revolution's ideals, commitments, and goals are most clearly exposed. This Constitution shows the model of nation the revolution had as its project, shows on which basis the revolutionary expected Mexico's progressive and democratic transformation. Article 39, with a long constitutional history dating from the days of the struggle for independence, proclaims national sovereignty resides essentially and originally in the people, from which every power derives and is instituted in the own people's benefit, the people having at all times the right to alter or modify the form of its government. Article 3 establishes official education lay and free, forbidding any religious corporations or any religious ministry to create or direct elementary schools. Article 27 is the core of the revolution's constitution. In it is the recognition of the nation's rights to impose private property, the characteristics dictated by public interest, to regulate the exploitation of natural resources, of landless villages to receive land granted by the state. Article 123 recognized workers' rights to a maximum working journey of 8 hours, to a sufficient minimum wage, and to strike. Article 130 established the non-recognition of personality to religious organizations denominated churches, forbade religious ministers to criticize the nation's laws or comment on national political events, as well as the prohibition to political organizations to identify through any religious notions. Peasants' demands for land became the most important demand in the revolution. Land distribution and agrarian reform as a more comprehensive process became the core of revolutionary policies, and after the 1917 Constitution, proclamation and the establishment of constitutional governance, the political and social measure of how governments were giving satisfaction to their revolutionary commitments. Carranza, for example, distributed 292,000 acres. The following 6 administrations, in a period that goes from 1920 to 1924, distributed 16.5 million acres, most of what could be classified as marginal lands. The distribution of this surface did not appease the peasants' demands. During the Cárdenas administration, from 1934 to 1940, land distribution accelerated and affected high-quality land. Land distributed amounted to 39 million acres, more than double of the previously distributed, and was complemented with irrigation policy and the impulse of the peasants' political organization carried on under the government's initiative. Since Madero's, the relationship between the government and the foreign-owned oil companies had been, to say the least, rough. In June 1912, Madero's government increased oil export tax by 20 cents per ton, equivalent to 3 cents per barrel, an insignificant increase even in those days, and immediately Ambassador Lane Wilson sent a harsh diplomatic note protesting against the dismissal of American railway conductors, the supposed pressure the governor was putting in a conflict with British owners of a large hacienda, and the discriminatory and almost confiscatory tax on oil products export. By the end of 1914, constitutionalist forces occupied Tampico. The military commander, Lieutenant Colonel Francisco Mujica, required oil exporters to register at the customs office so they could pay their taxes. Oil companies protested and refused to do so, which made Colonel Mujica order the closure of the pipelines through which oil flowed to be exported. Under this pressure, American companies accepted to pay their taxes in the customs office in Tampico. El Águila of British ownership, Mexican from a legal point of view, paid under protest. When Carranza's administration decreed in 1917 new taxes on oil exports and on land compromised with oil contracts, the oil companies launched a big wave of protests and demands of justice protection. When a new legislation of drilling concessions in national lands was approved in 1920, protests reached such a dimension, the government suspended the granting of drilling concessions. A few weeks after taking office, President Calles announced a new law would be proposed to regulate oil exploitation. The sole announcement, the bill still under elaboration, made Secretary of State Kellogg protest harshly against the Mexican government for certain agrarian action and for increasing workers' salaries, nothing to do with oil legislation. At the same time, Ambassador Sheffield attacked the new, still unknown legislation. Situation became so tense by the end of the year, 1925, armed intervention was expected, so President Calles ordered the military commander in La Huasteca, one of the main oil-producing areas, to put the wells on fire if an American intervention took place. President Portes Gil, who succeeded Calles, wrote in his memoirs, and I quote, "General Calles left events serenely go by, and when he had the conviction armed intervention of the United States would be a reality in a few hours, he telegraphed the American president, telling him he was sending, with a person of his absolute confidence, original, very important documents he wished him to know before the crime of invading national territory was committed. And if after reading those documents, the government of the United States still maintained its aggressive attitude against Mexico, he would make them public so the world could judge the unheard of outrage to be committed against a weak nation only defending its sovereignty. Those documents were Secretary of State Kellogg's letters, which had reached President Calles' hands through means up to now in the deepest mystery. On September 22, Ambassador Sheffield left his post. End of the quote. Those letters showed the involvement of Ambassador Sheffield and Secretary of State Kellogg with the oil companies, obtained by a spy infiltrated in the embassy of Mexico, who directly reported to President Calles, known by a code name but never identified. So oil was a matter of conflict between the United States and Mexico since the revolution took power, and regulating oil exploitation was a matter of national sovereignty. The most important feat of revolutionary policy is undoubtedly the expropriation of the oil companies and the nationalization of oil industry in 1938. By the end of 1933, the National Revolutionary Party's convention approved the 6-year plan for the term 1934-1940 and proclaimed Lázaro Cárdenas its presidential candidate. The plan stated nationalization of subsoil would become effective, as well as the state's intervention to balance economic forces in oil industry, stimulating the development of national enterprises. The plan made no mention of expropriation. By the end of 1936, oil workers from several unions united to form a unique union, which on May of the next year demanded from the companies an increase in wages and improvements in working conditions. Demands were rejected by the companies. The workers declared a strike, and the government intervened, declaring what in Mexico's labor right is called an economic conflict, leaving the judicial cause follow its course, but allowing the workers not to interrupt working so the oil production could continue. Labor authorities, in several instances, ruled in favor of the workers, the companies rejecting the sentences, till the case arrived to the Supreme Court, which confirmed the sentence in favor of the workers. Lázaro Cárdenas kept a diary in which we find his thoughts during the last days of the oil conflict. My personal impression is Cárdenas, before becoming president, and even with the oil conflict under course, thought a better control of oil industry was necessary, as well as an increased participation of the state in oil exploitation, but considered unviable the possibility of nationalizing oil industry, which had as a previous and necessary step the expropriation of private oil companies, the most important of them of foreign property, and if he ever thought of this possibility, he kept it for himself as an ideal very difficult to make it turn into reality. But the evolution of the labor conflict began to open new perspectives. In his diary on January 1st, 1938, the last sentence of the labor authorities given favorable to the workers a few days before, and the case already in the hands of the Supreme Court for the definitive resolution, Cárdenas wrote, I quote, "National unrest, foreign oil companies, supported by their governments, always rebel to submit to the nation's laws. We shall see. Restore to the nation's full domain the conceded deposits. They keep as simple reserves, preventing the country's progress." A large note appears dated March 9. It says, "On the 7th, by contact of the United States Embassy, the oil companies' representatives asked to meet with me. They said the companies faced the impossibility to comply with the sentence, consulting if its compliance could be postponed. Answer was given to them. The process had ended and they had to comply with it. At hour 22, the same day, I met with the leadership of the oil union, which informed me they had decided the termination of the working contracts, seeing the company's rebellious attitude, expressing once more their support to the government's decision. Mexico has today," wrote Cárdenas as a reflection to himself, "the great opportunity of liberating from political and economic pressures exerted over the country by the oil companies exploiting for the benefit one of our major richness. Several revolutionary administrations have tried to intervene in the subsoil's concessions granted to foreign companies, but circumstances have not been propitious for existing international pressures and internal problems. But today, conditions are different. There are no armed confrontations within the country, and a new world war is at the threshold. And England and the United States frequently talk in favor of democracies and respect to the sovereignty of the nation. So it may be the moment to see if the governments that speak so comply with their saying when Mexico makes use of its sovereign rights. On returning from Zacatepec, continues that day's annotation, I called out of the car General Francisco Mujica, Secretary of Communications. I made him known my decision to expropriate the oil companies' assets if they resisted to comply with the Supreme Court sentence. We thought there wouldn't be such a propitious opportunity as the one present to restore the nation its oil richness. Not doing so for the fear of possible democratic demands for England or the United States would be anti-patriotic and with serious responsibilities the people with justice would claim from us. On March 10, Cárdenas wrote, "Up to now, no official mention has been made of the purpose to expropriate. When time comes, notice will be given. In political and financial centers, it's generally believed, even by the companies, the government might arrive only to dictate the occupation of the industrial installations. Decision on this serious problem cannot wait much longer." On March 18, around 10 p.m., the expropriation of the oil companies was announced. But during all these years we've been talking about, until the present, what happened with elections, designation of candidates and the like. The 1917 Constitution set the foundations of a new institutional life. Problems could be handled and solved according to the rule of law, but when succession times arrived, democratic institutions showed they were still too frail. Vote was not strong enough, citizens were not politically organized, factions with sound revolutionary background confronted, and it had to be the force of arms which decided successions in 1920, 24, and 28, 29. Exploring and trying to find the ways to consolidate the political system emerged from the revolution, as well as to keep internal peace, a new political party was created, the National Revolutionary Party, a confluence of the then existing regional parties and regional political bosses, where real power became then concentrated and was exercised by the strong hand of who came to be called the maximum chief of the revolution, ex-President Calles, situation that lasted for 6 years after he left the presidency, the period known as the Maximato. Succession during Maximato, even if there were political confrontations between candidates within the PNR, was solved peacefully in 1930 and in 1934. When a stark confrontation between the president and the maximum chief put an end to Maximato in 1935, the last word in political decisions transferred fully to the president. Going from 1934 to 1982, we find Mexican political system in transition from a system with a certain grade of flexibility to a completely rigid political system, and from a system committed with the revolution's ideals and goals to a system that not only denied pertaining to the revolution's political current, but consciously and consistently taking actions against revolutionary works, legislation, and institutions. In regard to how the candidates of the official party were designated, I may say 1940, 46, and 1952, confrontation of candidates within the governing group took place, the president playing the role of an arbiter, and the official resulting candidate running against an opposition candidate with the same common origin. From 1958 on, that's until 2000, the candidate of the PRI is the candidate of the official party was a personal, intimate, and uncontested decision of the president. By mid-1986, things began to change. A contested movement emerged and expanded within the PRI, and more widely within the Mexico's dominant political system. This was the democratic current. Its main demands were to the government to pay more attention to the people's social conditions, and to the party to abide to its internal rules and elect its candidates through democratic procedures. In a short time, the party was to face the election of its presidential candidate as well as of congressional candidates for the 1988 elections. The democratic current penetrated in the party's rank and file. The president's non-written faculties, that is, his power to decide who would be his successor, began to be publicly contested. The system's apparatus closed ranks around the president. The democratic current was harshly attacked by the system. Every possibility of acting within the party was denied to its members, and when the president exercised his non-formal faculty of designating the party's presidential candidate, the democratic current broke with the PRI and passed to opposition, forming with other political parties and social organizations the National Democratic Front. Democratization from within the system turned to be a lost battle, but it was nevertheless the beginning of a political transition. As many of you may well recall, the 1980 election was a major fraud committed against the people who trusted in the effectiveness and force of their vote, and had, as ever before, massively and enthusiastically mobilized and participated in the election. Opposition resorted to every legal and political resource trying to stop the consummation of fraud and make the vote respected, but people were not organized. Culture of citizens' political organization and participation was feeble, not to say inexistent. The National Democratic Front didn't have the capacity to assemble popular force enough through peaceful means to make the government move from its decision. Imposition occurred once more, but the main forces in the Democratic Front made the decision to continue the struggle to democratize Mexico's political system. The first goal to be reached had to be the gain of full respect for the vote. Turning this goal into a reality took some years and important events. Some of them painful and tragic had to happen. Over 600 people assassinated, the assassins remaining unpunished in the organization process of a new political party. A policy of continued frauds in local elections and repressions to progressive opposition. The Zapatista uprising in southern Mexico, the assassination of a presidential candidate, a deep economic crisis. At the same time, people becoming more and more conscious their participation and their vote could make Mexico change, and the people putting pressure on the state till political decisions and legal reforms to make electoral authority independent from the executive were made, amendments of the electoral legislation introduced, media open to opposition parties and candidates, and finally, in 1997, the midterm federal election in which the vote was respected, the official party losing, for the first time in history, absolute majority in the lower chamber of Congress, and progressive opposition winning the election of mayor of Mexico City. The first time in Mexico's history in which this official was elected by popular vote. From then on, we can consider we have real elections in Mexico, even if our electoral system needs still to be improved. In 2000, elections gave way to alternation. A party different from the one in office would head the executive in the term 2000-2006. In 2006, once more, we had a contested election, not because the votes were wrongly counted or figures altered, but because there had been illegal interventions during the electoral process in support of the two candidates with higher outcomes. But Mexican democracy and what the Mexican people have been fighting for are not only to assure the vote of every citizen is fully respected. Democracy is that and much more. It's equality. And Mexican society is one of the most unequal in the world. 1% of the richest households concentrate 9.2% of the gross income. 1% of the poorest households concentrate 0.07%. That is 130 times less. Democracy is welfare, and poverty affects 65% of total population, 70 million people. It is welfare, and over 40 million of the labor force lack social security, and 26 million Mexicans live in informal economy. It means growth, and Mexican economy decreased in 2009 6.5%, with an optimistic expectations of growth this year of 1% in relation to the gross domestic product. It means opportunities, and during the past year, over 1 million formal jobs were lost, unemployment reaching over 20 million people. Democracy means opportunities in Mexico, and over 12 million Mexicans have been forced by circumstances to live and work in an irregular migratory situation in the United States. It means access to knowledge, and education and research budgets are being cut. This situation may be partly a consequence of the world crisis, but it's also a consequence of decades of bad policies and of making a priority of public policies the concentration of wealth in a few and fixing sight and heart outside our borders. To overcome this situation, we have to bring to our minds which have been the goals Mexicans have been struggling for during this past century, and how has this struggle taken place. The revolutionary fought for democracy, for equality and justice, for education, knowledge and culture, for a just and generous nation, for shared progress and a fair and equitable world order. To build a new Mexico, the lessons we can derive from the Mexican Revolution show us the way. Thank you.